So we must do two things, two great things together to encompass that enormous new view that lies before us, but to encompass it within the framework of science, to see it within the whole categorical framework of science, and to see that these two are not separate, but that they are wedded. The bigness of the idea, the newness of the idea, the greatness of it is one with the structure of science, the structure of being itself.
And as we begin again, I want to remind you of what we're doing and to again give a little recap of each level as we come to it. I hope that's okay. I'm going to do it anyway. So, we come out from the standpoint of science itself, the infinite one itself, and we ask a question about the nature of God. We ask that level something about God's nature. With each synonymous term, we are addressing the question of the nature of God, and the levels are going to help us to understand that nature and that synonymous term from their standpoint, or from each individual standpoint, the individual standpoint of each further level. And we said that actually there are no ideas on the level of science itself, per se. So this is a concession that the level of science itself makes, as though to say, I want to help you to discern what the highest ideas are in each of these seven. What are those ideas that express the highest sense, which would concern the synonymous term being what it is within itself, in itself, as itself, so to say. So that's what the level of science itself is going to tell us. And now we want to look at soul. We've taken mind and spirit and felt that we were building up something quite tremendous, quite beautiful, really, together. And now we come to soul, and when we ask about soul from that standpoint of wanting to know what is soul as itself, without any relationship, with no relationship to soul's idea of itself, no relationship to a specific idea of soul, no relationship to the human condition or to error as such, we see that the highest ideas of soul are those which depict soul as what it itself is. So you have that gathering, that cluster again of ideas that all somehow belong to this level, and we will now read them. We have, for instance, the infinite withinness, sinless, self-sameness, the one ego, unchangeability, immortality, identity. And now the calculus is going to order that intrinsic field of ideas, that group of ideas that are intrinsic to the level of science itself. We know that from that great work of the structuring of the ideas on the levels of being, which was so beautifully done through the work of Max Kapler. And so the word now will bring out a word sense about what soul itself is. And we try to feel now what the word is saying. As a reminder, let us remind ourselves that not every idea may be in its final place. These results are not set in concrete, that we're scientists, that we're working with our subject. But at this moment in time, at this point of time, we ask, what would the word say? We see that the Word would say that soul itself is identity. It's the identity of being. It has all to do with identity and the fact that being itself as soul is identity. And we'll see that that idea, identity, somehow patterns itself all through the levels. We'll just see that identity of soul popping up in different forms and different transformations of itself as we go further and further through the levels. And in all the further standpoints that we touch, we'll feel that behind everything now is that idea, identity. Or we could also call that the self-sameness of being. That being is that which is self-same. It is infinitely self-same. Is that clear that you would have identity and self-sameness at the point of the word, stating what soul is? And now when the Christ wants to qualify that, the Christ wants to say something about that sense of what soul is innately, and it says what on the level of science itself? It says soul is that which is unchanging. It cannot be changed. And immediately I can go back to the Word, because the Christ is always qualifying the Word, and see, well, what is it that cannot be changed? It's the identity. The self-sameness cannot be changed. It's always the Christ that looks after the integrity of the Word, that maintains and sustains the integrity of the Word, to be sure that it is always expressed as what it is, and that nothing can come in to change that, to undermine it. It's the unchangeability of soul, and the fact that soul is sinless. Sinless. I know it seems like a funny term to have here. It seems that that idea should be down somewhere in the human, right? Except that when you study deeply the references in the Christian Science textbook to soul, you find that Mrs. Eddy says soul is sinless. We don't even have to say Mrs. Eddy says, we can say the textbook says soul is sinless. So it isn't here that man is sinless, or man should be sinless, or man ought to deal with sin. She says soul is sinless, and in doing so gives a very, very high connotation to the term sinless. Namely, that being is unchangeable. It's unchanging from itself. It cannot deviate from itself. You see, to sin is to deviate, to become deviant from, to deviate from. It's very deep, or high, or whatever you want to call it, that fact that soul is incapable of changing, of being deviant from itself, of straying from its identity, from its own identity. So we take the authority to have that idea sinless here. We take our authority from the textbook. It's not me. It's not even Dr. Kapler. It's just what the textbook teaches, and if we understand it, we understand its place value at that very high level of divine science. So just remember that soul, and consequently, you see, by implication, the whole of being never deviates from itself. It can never not be what it is in its identity. that which makes being what it is identity, is its identity, and that can never change. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. You know, you just have to sit quietly with these things and love them and speak to them and ask them to tell you what they are and what they mean. And it's a holy thing. It becomes a holy atmosphere. Actually, I think she refers to divine science as the atmosphere of God. And so that identity is unchangeable. The Christ keeps it what it is. The Christ will always be responsible for the fact that that which is the Word cannot change, but that it will change everything on the further levels that needs to be changed. And there we would really allude to the level of Christian Science, so that when we actually come to Christian Science, we have those things that have to be changed, and it's the Christ that does that. Isn't that gorgeous? Out of the source of the unchangeability of the identity of being, soul. And then we come to Christianity, and we have those ideas that we see are very high because they describe soul as itself from the standpoint of Christianity. And let's see if we can feel that. That as Christianity, we would see that soul is the infinite withinness of being. Infinite withinness. What do you feel? Do you get that sense, the sense that soul is, well, we would see it, you see, on the further level in divine science as the infinite capacity. But with infinite withinness, you have that innate ability for that identity to express itself in its absolute fullness, to express its unchangeability and the whole, really, of what it is without limit, to express that self-sameness without limit. It's as though you have that infinite withinness as the realm of the infinitely expressed identity of being. It's an unlimited ability to be all that it is and can be. And you also have the idea immortality, the immortality of being, which seems to again have a touch of the human, something about how the human perceives this very highest kind of idea on the level of science itself. That immortality, you see, that term is a term adapted to the human perception of this fact, the fact of an eternal realm of innate identity in expression without limit. This is immortality, without time or space element. No mortal element in it, you see. No mortal form. It has no mortal form. You have to feel these things out spiritually. Some are clearer than others, and there's, you see, with immortality, too, there's the sense of there being no end to it. Soul says, all that you have seen about mind and spirit, this is of an immortal nature. It is not in anything. Think of that. It's not in anything. It is its own infinite withinness, and therefore immortal. You see, first of all, from the standpoint of the Word, then, that soul would say, that which you've seen about mind and spirit, this is the identity of being. This is identity. It is infinite infinitely self-same. And then the Christ would say, it can never be changed. What we've seen about mind and spirit, Soul says that is the identity of being that can never be changed. And as Christianity, it has therefore the quality of immortality, never having an end to it, never having a beginning to it. It's immortal. It is expressed illimitably as the infinite withinness of being. And when science would look at the ideas of soul and ask about the highest idea, it would really be soul at that point, which says, I, soul, am the divine ego. I am that I am. I am what I am. We have to train ourselves now not to have that statement in isolation somewhere. You see, that I am, and here and there we kind of rattle it off, or we feel it comes into the picture, a scientific picture that we are entertaining. But here we see it in its place value, that it's not a statement in isolation somewhere, but it is having a place value that is related to everything else in the whole design of being, related to everything that we've seen so far, and everything that we will see and understand about being. That soul says mind and spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, love, this is the I am that I am. And you know, it's written in the present tense. Apparently when you see the Hebrew, when they translate the Hebrew, it's in Hebrew there's no, am I correct, no past tense, no future tense. That's all implied in the present tense statement. So that soul would really be saying that mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love, this is the I am that I am. It is the I am that I have always been, therefore. The I am that I always will be. Get that very high touch of science, looking back at the identity that the Word has set forth as the statement of the Word, as what soul is, the identity of being. And here we see that that identity is the divine ego. So the one mind, the only spirit, becomes the divine ego in soul. And this gives us also a hint at how we can practice by flowing like categories or like points of intersection. Do you understand what I mean by that? You see what I just did? I went back to mind. What is mind at the same point of science, in science itself? It's the one mind. And as spirit, what is it as spirit? It's the fact that spirit is the only, you see. What does soul say about that? That one mind, that only spirit, is the divine ego. It's the I am that I am. Okay, very good. And then we come to the level of divine science. We know that it's there that the calculus appears really for the first time, that we have actually made a concession to overform our subject with the calculus on the science level for the sake of our understanding, really. But that for being itself, the calculus does not come into full expression as a main subject until we touch divine science. There it is the main subject because it is showing us the idea of that infinite principle, the content of that infinite principle, the self-conception of that infinite principle. So it is showing us the divine principle's own innate inner realm. That's divine science. When we adapt that to a question then about the synonymous term and its ideas, we ask, what then is soul in its own realm? Soul as a realm. If something has a realm, it means it has a sphere of expression. Isn't that clear? Is that clear? It's the realm within which it expresses itself, how it expresses itself. So soul is expressing itself as a whole creation, a creation as a whole, which would be the idea of soul. It's a whole creation of soul's idea. We're not talking about ideas here in terms of the office of the level of divine science. We're talking about the realm of soul in which soul shows forth its own idea of itself as a whole. So we are going to look now at soul's inner realm, so to say, and see that soul is ever one with its idea, with its infinite self-conscious creation of itself. And what is soul in that realm in relation to its creation as a whole? As the Word, I think we could see that it is a realm of self-symmetry. It's the realm of the perfect self-symmetry of being. Being completely self-symmetrical. So that within the self-sameness, when we look into the content, the idea, the realm of the self-sameness of being, we find this perfection of self-symmetry. The perfection of self-symmetry, which is the balance of soul itself, the perfect balance of soul. One thinks of the elegance of soul, the proportion of soul, the perfect proportionality of being, everything in balance. That soul looks at its creation, its idea, and says this is a creation of self-symmetry, everything symmetrical, wholly symmetrical. It's really beautiful. And actually, that's what it means. Being is really beautiful. These are ideas that are actually coming out in the world today. They're being brought forth through the science of complexity and the science of chaos. And these sciences are coming to terrific conclusions about what symmetry is, what self-similarity is. They talk about self-symmetry and self-similarity, that the whole world is patterned in that way. The whole universe is just exhibiting the fact of pattern across scale. And just to kind of tweak your remembrance of these things, you remember that they are explaining order, and therefore chaos, so-called, through the understanding of fractal geometry. Namely, that the whole universe is one of fractal geometry, and that all of the forms that we as human beings have always taken as fundamental, for instance, when we look at our buildings, our houses, our man-made structures and so forth, and we have taken, I guess it would be these Euclidean forms, the forms of Euclidean geometry. Somebody please correct me if I'm wrong. It's just recalling really off the top of one's head that those forms, for instance, would be squares and circles and triangles and so forth, that what they are finding is that these are not the fundamental forms in nature, but that there is another geometry as well, a geometry that goes throughout the whole of nature.